Right, it's 5 past, so I think it's this is a good time to start. Thank you all for coming to listen to hear me talk about OpenFOAM input-output performance on Archer. For a bit of background about this project and about me, I'm most definitely not a computational fluid dynamicist, and I've only ever heard of OpenFOAM prior to working on this. Like for me, before this project, before working on this, OpenFOAM was that really cool software that makes some really nice pictures. So I knew nothing about OpenFOAM coming into this, and didn't have masses of time to work on this project. So I feel pretty safe and confident in saying that I still know very little about OpenFOAM. But I've definitely gotten a good impression of quite how little I know about OpenFOAM and the many possibilities and uses of it. But with that, actually, the things that I'm going to talk about are, while they are specific to OpenFOAM, they can have other uses for other programs, and hopefully you guys will find this interesting. I imagine that this talk will be quite short. I'd be very surprised if we're still here at 3:30. Yeah, so with that, here's the work that I've done on this subject. To start off with, for those of you who aren't aware what OpenFOAM is, OpenFOAM stands for Open Source Field Operation and Manipulation. It's a open source free computational fluid dynamics software, which is written entirely in C++. I've read that originally it was written in Fortran in the late 80s, early 90s at Imperial College. But yeah, current version is entirely C++, and it's very efficiently parallelized and really quick. And it's widely used on Archer. I believe it's very often in the top 20 most programs on Archer. It's got a number of different uses. You can use it to do quote-unquote basic computational fluid dynamics. You can do incompressible flows, compressible flows, multi-phase flows. Combustion you can model using OpenFOAM. The electromagnetics. One of the most interesting ones actually that I've found is it's possible to use OpenFOAM to study certain financial models. Basically, for that, the financial models in questions are partial differential equations, and because OpenFOAM deals with fluid fields, usually having a good partial differential equation solver is part of the package, so it's nicely versatile. But one of the things about OpenFOAM until quite recently, until 2017, is that it had what I'll refer to as the file problem. And the file problem boils down to, very simply, OpenFOAM would create one file per physical property, per processor, per time step. And it would do this for any simulation you run. So okay, that's fine if you're using a low number of processors, because the number of files created isn't that large. Also fine if you're not outputting that many physical properties. Also fine if you're not outputting very many very many time steps. However, and this is where the specifically Archer part of the presentation comes in. On HPC systems like Archer, well, usually you're not going to use a very small number of processors, and you don't get very interesting physical data by just outputting a small number of for a small number of time steps. So very quickly you can get into situations where OpenFOAM will create thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of files during one single simulation. And this can be an issue because for Archer users out there, this is a picture that I've taken from one of my accounts off Safe. As you can see, on Archer, I have this account. I've got access to work. And on work, I have a maximum allowable 500,000 files. If I'm producing 100,000 files per run, using OpenFOAM, then I'm not going to be able to do much more than 5 runs, and that's if I don't have anything else there. So this can be an issue, and this is a well-known issue. I had someone tell me earlier today that they have a friend who stress tested a computer cluster by essentially running an OpenFOAM code and hitting the inode limit, i.e. the limit maximum number of different files you could have on the cluster by using OpenFOAM. But OpenFOAM are aware of this, and in 2017, with OpenFOAM version 1706, they brought out a new method of dealing with this writing issue, of essentially, instead of having every processor write one file per physical property per output time step, they would only have the master processor write that file for everyone. So essentially, the simulation would run, and all processors would tell that master processor, okay, here's what you should write at this time step for me, and the master processor would write everything. And they'd done this, they claimed, in a way that was efficient and wouldn't slow down the program too much. And it seems like they've done that really well, reasonably well. If you look online for performance of the collated, performance of collated file system, file handling for OpenFOAM, most people seem to say that they get good results for that, as in they get decent speeds, their system isn't slowed down too much, and things like that. However, few people have access to as many processors as we do here on Archer. So we thought it would be interesting to see, to test this, to see how good they managed to make their collated file system. And to do that, as I said, I'm very new to OpenFOAM, so I didn't dig too deep into difficult simulations or anything like that. I used the box standard first tutorial example system, the lid-driven cavity flow. I've made some changes to it so that it would run. Turns out that if you put too many grid points in not enough space, OpenFOAM has a tendency to crash. So I have made some changes. So instead of having a box, which is in the tutorial, I believe the box is 0.1 by 0.1 by 0.01 meters, I changed it to a 2 by 5 by 1 meter. And I've got 200 grid points per meter, so that my box is divided into 400 by 300 by 200 grid points. This example tracks 6 physical properties. The properties are, there's the pressure, there's the field, there's the velocity, I think there's a transport property, and I can't remember the other two. Time is one of them, and I can't remember the last one. But yeah, so 6 different properties, meaning that without the collated file system, you would produce 6 files per time step per processor. And what I did for all of the stuff that I'm about to show you is I ran 10 runs that each produced 10 outputs. And the way that these runs were is essentially the run would start. The run would start, and then every time step I would output all 6 of those physical properties, so that essentially my runs were literally just writing and some tiny amount of calculation, but essentially writing. And to speed up my runs even more, I actually set the lid velocity to 0. So what do I mean by that? Well, this system, the idea of this system is, imagine that you've got a cavity which is surrounded by walls on 3 sides. There's a wall on the bottom and on the left and right side. And then you take the top wall and just drag it along at some constant velocity. That's what this simulation and the system is meant to represent. But here, to save time, to even not having to, to not bother with even calculating the new velocities and things like that, I decided, you know what, we don't need to even drag that lid along. And all of that made the runs be very quick and really emphasize just the right time, because that's what I'm trying to get at. The other thing to point out is the size of the data that I'm writing. Every time step, roughly speaking, I'm outputting 2 gigabytes of data. which is important when you're trying to get the efficiency of write outputs. But so this is to give you an idea of the system. So far, so good. So what does that mean? Well, this means that as you increase the number of processors, you'd expect that the uncollated OpenFOAM, as in the OpenFOAM version that will print one file per processor per physical attribute, will grow linearly, and it does. And this is roughly the line of how it grows. If you've got 10 processors, you've got 60 files, and as you increase to 1,000 processors, you've got 6,000 files. However, the collated version, because there's only ever one processor that's doing all of the writing, you're always stuck at 6 files. So there's some time save there. Sorry, not some time save, but there's a huge, it's a huge difference, especially once you get past 100 processors, 100 processors being roughly 4 Archer nodes. So there is going to be some difference, or at least you'd expect there's going to be some difference, and I wanted to see what that difference is. So okay, what's the effect on performance? First thing I did was I ran the simulations, exactly the same simulations, 10 times at different node counts, so different processor counts, for an uncollated and a collated system. And already this is quite interesting. The points are at starting at the leftmost point and going right. They are for 1, 2, 4, 16, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and 32 nodes. And there's 24 processors per node, so you can guess how many cores there are. And for low node counts, for anything below roughly 8 nodes, there's very little difference between whether you're collating or not. Both systems run roughly as fast as one another. They take the same number of seconds per time step. Note that this is the second per time step rather than this time over the entire node. There's some error in these, but the error bars are so small that they're smaller than the points. So yeah, for below 8 nodes, they're roughly the same. They're roughly equivalent. The nice thing is that one of them doesn't output as many files as the other, so that's quite nice. However, as you increase past 8 nodes to 16 and 32 nodes, there starts being a much larger difference, a much more noticeable difference between the two. And indeed, if you look at just the performance, the speed up versus a single node job, you'll notice that above 8 nodes, the uncollated system still performs very, very close, slightly better, but very, very close to ideally, whereas the collated system is starting to taper off. Unfortunately, I had a couple of simulations running that were meant to finish yesterday afternoon for larger node counts, because obviously you look at these and you're like, well, okay, at 32 nodes, the collated system seems to be no longer ideal, but how unideal is it? And to test that, I would need to do a run at 128 or at higher node counts. I had these simulations running, but unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, I wasn't able to get the finished simulations. So that gives you an idea of the overall performance of the program. However, that doesn't really give you an idea of how much of that time is spent in just writing the outputs. And there is a difference. There's a significant difference of about 5 seconds between the collated and uncollated runtime for the 32 processor job, but there's no way for us to tell whether that difference is entirely due to the amount of time that it takes for the collated system to write versus the amount of time it takes for the uncollated system to write. So I wanted to check. I wanted to make sure that the write time was indeed where all that time was being lost. And the way I came up with to check that originally was, well, it looks like there's a way of profiling OpenFOAM. OpenFOAM has a flag in the bash RC that everyone needs to source whenever they compile and run OpenFOAM, where you can set the profiling option. And one of the profiling options you can get is you can choose to profile using gprof. I thought, okay, cool, great, this is perfect. So I spent ages trying to get that to work, and the result I got, for those of you who've ever used gprof on OpenFOAM, you can see where this is going, is this. Basically, the amount of time that OpenFOAM takes in each process is less than the sensitivity time of gprof, meaning that gprof only considers processes that take longer than 0.1 second to 0.01 seconds to finish. And yeah, unfortunately, none of the processes did, especially at higher node counts. But I mean, even here, this is only at one node, so this is 24 cores worth of 24 processors worth, or parallelized over 24 processors, and already all of the steps, all of the individual steps take less than that 0.01 second, meaning that I get no times. I do get, however, that a O stream, so the way that OpenFOAM writes to file, I do get that that was called a significant number of times. However, as far as gprof is concerned, it was called loads, but it took 0 seconds, so good luck. So that was a bit disappointing. Though I should have seen that one coming. So I had to then think of another way of trying to output exactly the amount of write time. And the way that I came up with is really stupid, but very efficient, which is essentially, as I mentioned at the start, I'm running the simulation for 10 time steps, and I'm outputting every time step. Presumably, if I run this simulation for 10 time steps but only output on time step 10, the difference in time will tell me how much time was spent writing for 9 of those 10 time steps. So that's what I did, and the outputs that I got are as follow. And they're actually quite interesting, because here this really emphasizes that for high node counts, again, for unfortunate technical reasons, I don't have this data for node counts less than 4 for the uncollated version, but for node counts higher than 4, there is a significant difference in the output time per step for the uncollated versus the collated version, and we're talking a difference of 3 or 4 seconds. Now that doesn't sound like much, but if you've got a difference of 4 seconds on a system where you're outputting your time steps 1,000 times, it all adds up. And this difference also grows, like, so at the 32 node count, that becomes much closer to 4.55-ish. And the other thing I really want to draw your attention to is, if you look at the collated curve on the left, it drops, but then suddenly for that last point, it seems like the write time has increased a bit. Why might that be? Well, at this point, you've got 32 times 24 processors all sending their information to one processor, who then needs to write everything. This can create log jams, and that can increase the amount of time that it takes to write everything. So again, I imagine that if we were to increase this node count a couple of times, that might keep increasing, which would make the collated version of the program perform even less well. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is how long output time takes compared to the total runtime. And for those of you with good memories, you'll remember that at very low node counts, the amount of time that it took for a job to run when I was using one node was around 130 seconds. So you've got a 9 seconds. 9 of those 130 seconds is just writing, so it's not that much. It's about what, 0.6, 0.7? Sorry, 6 or 7% of your time. However, as you increase the number of nodes that you're using, the proportion of time that's spent on writing these outputs increases and increases and increases. To the point that already at the 32 node count, more than half of the total simulation time is just writing out these files in the collated case. For the non-collated case, this is much, much lower. I mean, it's less than 20%. It's still quite high, but it's much lower and much less of an issue. One other thing I'd like to point out is I mentioned that the size of files that are output every time step is roughly 2 gigabytes. This is quite low, actually. I'm likely to rerun these simulations again with a much higher output size. I'm probably gonna be aiming for about 10 gigabytes, which should give better statistics on both of these curves, but also might give information about whether there is a sweet spot at which maybe for smaller, for smaller output sizes, it might be that the collated version is actually equally as performant as the uncollated version, and that's something that I'd like to look into and check. With that, that's basically the end of my presentation. So just to conclude, the main take-home messages are that for node counts less than 8, if you're producing a file that's roughly 2 gigabytes in size, whether you use a collated or an uncollated file handling method on OpenFOAM, you'll get roughly the same performance, and you'll spend roughly the same amount of time writing, more or less. However, as soon as you increase that node count past 16, the file per process seems to be better. What does that mean? It means it writes more quickly, which is to be expected because you don't have that time or that potential time loss where all of the processes send their data to a single master processor that then writes everything for them. However, there is a hidden cost that I've not considered yet, and I'd quite like to calculate as well when I do this again. And that is that, okay, it's nice to have, it's nice to have a faster system when running on 64. When running on 16 nodes and 384 cores, but what do you get at the end? Well, essentially what you get is 384 different files, each file having one subdirectory per time step, each subdirectory having one file per physical property. You need to recombine those somehow. And actually, OpenFOAM does give a very easy way of recombining those. You can just run a reconstruct par, which will recombine everything for you into one nice, lovely file. But there's a cost to that, and I've not looked at how quickly that reconstruct par takes. It might be that actually the amount of time that's saved by running a file per process rather than a file per simulation, it might be that the amount of time that we've saved that way is an amount of time that we then need to pay during this recombination. And if that's included, I have no idea how that might change these results. As you've seen, there's still, this is very much work still in progress. And I'm kind of hoping that when I have the definitive results, I will have the opportunity to present those again, because I think that while this work hints at a lot of interesting things, it's just not quite proven yet. So things like what happens at larger node counts, does file size make much of a difference, those sorts of things that I hinted at. I think it would be quite interesting to see what those effects are. Even if I do not get the opportunity to present these again here, there will definitely be some form of document that will be brought out, which will have all of this data. The other thing as well that document will have is a decent performance scaling for OpenFOAM, or at least for this particular problem in OpenFOAM, which will then help anyone wanting to use Archer to have already pre-made or some decent pre-made performance data of OpenFOAM on Archer. With that, I'd like to finish by thanking you all for sticking with me for this presentation. I did say I would finish by 3:30, and it looks like I've just about managed. And I wanted to also take the time to thank Juan and Claire, who Juan sets up, Juan is the person who's invited me to come and give this presentation, and both Juan and Claire set up everything in the background. So even setting up the session, sending reminder emails to everyone, all of that is done by them. And quite honestly, I've given presentations at various physical settings where there was more hassle than there has been giving these presentations. I also want to thank Adrian Jackson for essentially for putting up with all my strange own questions. As I said, I'm not an OpenFOAM expert, so every so often I'd go up to him and be like, hey, Adrian, is there a way to do this? And every time he'd very nicely say, yeah, there is, here's how you do it. So yeah, thank you all for your attention, and I'll happily answer questions if I can. So the first question I got, and that's a very good question, is which OpenFOAM version am I using? I was using OpenFOAM version 1912. The newest version available, actually there should be one that came out recently possibly, but the newest version available at the end of last month. So one of the questions I got is, when using the collated version, do you still need to use reconstruct par? No, essentially the way the collated version works is it creates a polymesh directory for each processor. And then it will create a n+1th file in which all of those outputs go to. So if I'm running on 24 processors, I'll get a 0 processor to 23 processor file which just has the polymesh information, but everything that's output will be output into processor 24, or I think processors 24, and everything will be as it would be in a reconstruct par file. So you do not need to reconstruct for using collated. One of the questions I got is, did I use different luster settings? I've not tested luster settings yet, and I actually, I've not looked at the bandwidth for the output times, but it's entirely possible that I am reaching the point where increasing the luster stripe count could improve the collated performance. However, there's still a significant gap already between the collated and uncollated performances. Next question is using collated version simple, or does it involve additional steps during setup? So using the collated version is exactly like using the uncollated version, except when you run your parallel, so when you run your parallel run, you just need to add the flag, like after adding the flag ---- parallel, you need to add the flag ---- file handler collated. Next question. Cool, I'm glad that helped, Thomas. Is it possible to restart from collated results with a different number of MPI ranks? Quite honestly, I do not know. I did not try that. But yeah, I would not be able to comment on that because I've not tried it. Sorry. Are those collated files readable for peer review? I would imagine so, yes. And could the overhead of the collated I/O be reduced by dedicating a single core to the writing, i.e., all other cores send the info needed, needing writing to a buffer, and then continue the simulation while the writing core writes the output, the files in the background? I think that's basically the way they do it already. However, I think that at the moment there is a single writing core, the single attributed writing core. Everything that everyone wants to write does go to buffer, and the writing core writes as it can, as and when it can. However, because, as I mentioned, changing from collated to uncollated is just a different flag, a different flag when running in parallel as opposed to when preparing your system, that single writing core does still need to perform calculations for its part of the subdomain. Whether it would be more efficient to have one core being idle all the time, because frankly, most of your simulations or most of the simulations that people run will, you'd expect that the computation would be more intensive than the writing part of the simulation. I'm not sure whether it would be a good use of your resources to have one completely idle processor for most of your simulation that's just waiting to write everything. I'm also not sure how they'd go about preparing that without fundamentally changing the way OpenFOAM is written. So 2 questions. One, is there a plan on competing the impact of reconstruct par against the slower collated processes? Yeah, that's something that I intend to do as soon as Archer is back up. I will finish making those graphs that you've seen, because some of them have a couple of points missing. I will also be running for a much larger file size per time step. And then the third thing I'll be doing is to time reconstruct par. Again, I mean, I guess it sort of depends on when you want to spend that time, because if it's the case of it takes 5 minutes, but you can run it on the login node, versus it taking, I don't know, 5 seconds, but it's running over a bunch of processors, maybe it is better to use that. I don't know, but I'm kind of interested in that time. Question 2 is, do you need to submit the parallel job for n+1 processors? No, you do not. So you submit your parallel job as normal. Let me just, yeah. So you submit your parallel job as normal. For Archer, you would have a line which is, if you're wanting to run on 24 processors, you'd run AP run minus N4, say icofoam in this case, minus parallel, minus file handler collated. And I'll type that in chat because that's not drastically useful. Me just saying that. So you'd write something like that, and you would be running on 24 processors, and it would create a 25th file in which all of the collated information goes in. So you still use 24 processors, as you would if it was uncollated, but you get 25 files. However, 24 of those 25 files will just have the mesh subdomain that a processor is looking at, and only that 25th file will have all of the physical properties that you were wanting to output. I hope that answers that question. As there are no more questions, I think we'll finish there. Thanks everyone again for coming, and if you have any more questions, please feel free to just send me an email. I'm happy to answer them by email. You can email me at j.sint@epcc.ed.ac.uk. I'll write that in the chat. Thanks, everyone.